The year was 1885. The New Mexico sun beat like a hammer against the parched earth. Thomas Jenkins sat in his cool, shadowed office in Silver City. He was a man who valued sharp profits and judged people by appearances. He looked at his daughter, Martha, and felt nothing but a lingering sense of shame. Martha was not like the other young women in town. She was tall and full-figured, with strong shoulders and a presence that commanded space. Her father called her foolish because she spent her hours reading complex ledgers instead of chasing potential husbands. He called her a burden because of her size and her quiet, observant nature. By the end of that week, Thomas would send Martha to a lonely rancher.
He thought he was finally rid of a problem. He never realized he was throwing away the only person who could have saved him. One Tuesday morning, he didn't even look up from his mahogany desk. "I have made an arrangement for you, Martha," he said. His voice was as dry and cold as the desert dust. "Silas Thorne needs a wife on his cattle ranch near the Gila River. You leave on the Friday stagecoach." Martha felt a cold, hard lump form in the back of her throat. She was 28 years old. In her father's eyes, she was nothing more than an unsold piece of inventory.
"Does Mr. Thorne know who I am?" Martha asked in a quiet, steady voice. Thomas Jenkins finally looked at her. His eyes were like chips of gray flint. "I told him you were a sturdy woman of limited wit. I told him you were suited for heavy labor and very little else." Martha did not argue. She had learned long ago that words were wasted on a man like her father. She went to her room and packed her mother's heavy oak trunk. It was filled with books on botany, history, and her grandmother's fine silver. When it was full, the trunk weighed nearly 100 pounds. It held almost everything Martha had been allowed to keep. When Friday morning came, Thomas didn't even bother to say goodbye. He watched from his high window as she climbed into the cramped stagecoach. He believed he was finally free of his greatest embarrassment. The journey to the Thorne Ranch took 2 long, bone-jarring days. As they climbed, the desert air grew thinner and sharper, carrying the scent of sage. Martha arrived at a fork in the dusty road near the Mogollon Mountains. The stagecoach driver dropped her massive trunk in the dirt with a thud. "Thorne's place is less than half a mile beyond that rocky rise," the driver said.
"The road is too rough for this coach to navigate. Good luck to you, lady." The stagecoach began to recede along the dusty road behind her. Martha looked at the massive trunk sitting in the dirt. She looked at the steep, rocky path ahead of her. She didn't wait for a miracle or a helping hand. She gripped the iron handles of the trunk with both hands. Her muscles began to burn beneath her dusty green traveling dress. She began to push and pull that heavy box up the incline. Sweat soaked her apron and stained her white car. She was a daughter of the frontier, even if her father was too blind to see it. Halfway up the rise, a man appeared at the crest of the hill. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and worn leather gloves. This was Silas Thorne. For one brief moment, surprise held him motionless. Then he saw the stagecoach rolling away in the distance. He started down the hill toward Martha with long, hurried strides. As he approached, he saw the exhaustion in her face and the determination in her eyes. He did not see the foolish, helpless woman Thomas Jenkins had described. He saw a woman who had been abandoned on a lonely road and still refused to surrender.
Silas reached her before she could pull the trunk any farther. Martha straightened and struggled to catch her breath. "Are you Silas?" she asked, her voice raspy and dry. The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your father said you were sturdy enough for ranch work," Silas said. "He also said you were too foolish to manage anything important." Martha wiped the sweat from her brow and looked him directly in the eyes. "My father says many things that are not true." Silas glanced at the trunk. "Your father described a helpless woman. But I see someone who refused to leave behind the things that mattered to her." He stepped forward and gripped the other iron handle. "Let's get you home, Martha." If Martha's courage speaks to you, subscribe and stay with us as she begins to transform this lonely ranch.
The Thorn Ranch was a place of heavy silence and long shadows. Silas had lived alone for 5 years since his first wife had passed away. The fences were sagging and in desperate need of repair. The ranch ledgers were stained with coffee and crowded with unfinished calculations. Silas was a good, honest man, but he was exhausted. He was fighting a losing battle against the drought and the local banks.
Martha spent her first days learning the difficult routines of the ranch. She did not behave like the foolish, helpless woman her father had described. On her third evening, Silas placed the ranch books on the small wooden desk. "Your father said you understood figures," he said tentatively. "Would you be willing to examine these?" Martha settled beneath the flickering lamplight and began to work. She saw exactly where the money was leaking out of the ranch. She discovered that the grain merchant in town had been systematically overcharging Silas. "Silas," she said one evening over a simple meal of salt pork, "you are paying 30% too much for your winter feed."
Silas dropped his fork in sheer surprise. "How could you possibly know that?" "I grew up in a dry goods store," Martha said calmly. "I know what grain and supplies should cost in this part of the territory." For the first time, Silas understood just how badly Thomas Jenkins had misjudged his daughter. He didn't see a plus-sized burden. He saw a woman with the mind of an experienced merchant. He saw someone with the patience to examine every vital detail. As the months passed, the ranch began to breathe with new life. Martha organized the kitchen, the pantry, and the future. She planted an orderly garden of beans, squash, and flowering herbs. She used her grandmother's silver to remind Silas that life could be beautiful. But the biggest change was happening in Silas himself. He began to smile when he saw her walking across the dusty yard. He stopped hiding in the dark shadows of his own lingering grief. One evening, Martha entered her room and stopped in the doorway. Silas had built a sturdy wooden bookshelf beneath the large window. Every book from her mother's trunk had been placed carefully upon it. Martha ran her fingers across the smooth, finished wood. "No one has ever made a place for my books before," she whispered.
Silas looked almost embarrassed by the gesture. "They are part of you," he said simply. "Anything that matters to you deserves a place in this house." Martha turned away before he could see the tears gathering in her eyes. All her life, Thomas had valued her only for the labor she could perform. Silas was the first person who treated her mind as something worthy of a home. One afternoon, Martha was tending to a sick calf in the barn. She was covered in hay, dust, and the scent of the earth. Silas walked in and watched her work for a long time. "Your father was wrong about you, Martha," Silas said quietly.
Martha wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. He was wrong about many things. He failed to recognize the most remarkable woman in his own home. Silas walked over and took her hand in his. His touch was gentle, despite his rough working calluses. "I do not want a servant, Martha. I want you beside me as my equal." Somewhere along the way, this ranch began to feel like a home again, and it was because you were here. Martha felt a single tear escape and roll down her dusty cheek.
For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen by another human being. Martha remembered the bookshelf Silas had built and the care with which he had arranged every one of her books. Then she looked into his eyes. "I would like to stay," she whispered. "Not because my father sent me here. Because this is where I choose to be." The following spring, they were married beneath the broad branches of a cottonwood tree. Silas did not promise Martha an easy life. Martha did not ask for one. They promised to meet whatever came as equal partners.
Under Martha's careful management, the ranch slowly recovered. By 1887, it was no longer threatened with immediate foreclosure. The fences stood straight and newly repaired. The cattle were healthier, and the debts were smaller. For the first time in years, the ranch showed a modest profit. They were not the wealthiest ranchers in the territory, but they had built a life that could endure. Meanwhile, in Silver City, things were not going well for Thomas Jenkins. Silver City was still busy, but Thomas was no longer prospering. He had invested most of his savings in 2 mining claims without examining the assay reports.
One claim produced almost nothing. The man who sold him the other disappeared before Thomas discovered that its records had been falsified. His dry goods store began failing beneath the weight of his debts. He remembered the daughter he had sent away 2 years ago. He thought of her as a mere servant to a poor, struggling rancher. He decided he would go and claim her help to save his skin. He expected to find her broken, tired, and miserable. He expected Silas Thorne to be a desperate man who would give Martha back. Thomas hired a buggy and drove out toward the Gila River. He arrived at the Thorne Ranch beneath the hard sun of an unusually warm October afternoon.
He didn't even recognize the place. The house had a wide porch, with flowers blooming in wooden boxes beneath the windows. He saw a woman standing among orderly rows of beans and herbs. She was wearing a fine linen dress and a wide sun hat. She looked powerful, radiant, and completely at peace. It was Martha. Thomas climbed out of his buggy, his expensive suit covered in dust. "Martha," he called out, his voice cracking with age and desperation. Martha turned and looked at him. She didn't run to him with open arms.
She didn't cry out with sudden joy. She stood her ground with the quiet dignity of a queen. "Father," she said, "what brings you to our land?" Thomas looked around, his eyes wide with a familiar greed. "I see you've done well for yourself," he said, trying to sound proud. "The store is having some temporary troubles. I've come to bring you home for a while to help me with the books." Silas Thorne stepped out onto the porch. He came to stand beside Martha, close enough to support her, but wise enough to let her speak for herself. Thomas looked at him. "You tell her to come home where she belongs." Silas looked at Martha. "That decision belongs to my wife." Thomas puffed out his chest. "She is my daughter." "You did not arrange a marriage," Martha said, stepping forward. "You handed your unwanted problem to a stranger." But Silas did not see a burden. He saw a woman worthy of love and respect. Martha looked at her father's tired, bitter face. She saw the regret in his eyes, but it was the regret of a man who lost money. It was not the regret of a father who had lost a child. "If your home is truly at risk, I will pay what is owed directly so you do not lose your roof," Martha said. "But I will not place money in your hands. And I will not return to Silver City to repair the life you chose to destroy. I am a Thorne now, and this ranch is my home." Thomas Jenkins realized then that he had no power in this place. While Martha had built a secure and loving home, Thomas had allowed his pride to ruin everything he once possessed. He had called her foolish, but he was the true fool of the story. He climbed back into his buggy without another word. He drove away as the sun began to set behind the purple mountains. Martha watched him go until he was just a speck of dust on the horizon. Silas held her hand tightly. "Are you all right, Martha?" he asked softly. Martha leaned her head on his sturdy shoulder. "I have never been better, Silas." They went inside their warm, beautiful home together. Martha's oak trunk sat in the bedroom, a symbol of her long journey. It was no longer a heavy burden to be dragged through the dirt. It was the treasure chest of her new, chosen life. If Martha's journey touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of courage, second chances, and love on the American frontier. Have you ever been underestimated by someone you loved? Share your story in the comments. Remember, your worth is never defined by someone who refuses to see it. This is a fictional Western romance inspired by life on the 19th century American frontier. The characters and events have been dramatized for your entertainment. AI tools may have assisted with parts of the creative process.
The final story and presentation were reviewed and directed by the channel creator.